My name is Jason Crawford, and I am the founder of a new nonprofit organization called The Roots of Progress. Some of you may know this as a blog that I've been running for the last couple of years, actually about the last 4 years, but we have recently launched it as a new nonprofit dedicated to establishing a new philosophy of progress for the 21st century. As part of that, I'd like to talk to you today about the history and the evolution of work and jobs. Just want to double check that my slides are up. Yes, it looks like they are. Great. So I want to start off by making this somewhat personal. I want you all to think about your work. Think for a moment about how did you choose your line of work? What does your work demand of you, both mentally and physically? And what are the rewards for your work, both money, intellectual challenge and fulfillment, spiritual meaning, anything? I know you're all like on vacation. You probably didn't want to think about work, but you know, this is a talk about work. What did you expect? So now that we've got that personal, modern context, I want you to think about what work was like before the Industrial Revolution. A couple of things characterized it. One, most work was highly physical, whether you were a farmhand or a blacksmith or in a glassblower's shop, perhaps, or a miner. You were working with your hands and your body. And most jobs paid very low real wages in terms of what you could buy for a day's labor. In Great Britain, in the mid-1700s, the average wage was less than $10 a day in modern currency. And the wages in Britain were relatively high for the world. Many other places were much poorer. Even when you had non-physical work to do, most work was fairly routine. There was little room for creativity or problem solving, and there was little choice of occupation. For one thing, there just weren't a lot of different jobs to choose from. There weren't as many jobs as we have today. And tradition and the guild system and so forth would typically force people into jobs that they didn't really choose. There were some better jobs. There were scientists, artists, philosophers, but these jobs were a rare privilege. Not everybody could just go sign up for them. Now contrast with today. Today we have a wide variety of jobs, many more jobs to choose from. Many of these jobs are not physically demanding at all. They involve mental work or very little physical work, such as office or retail jobs. And even the jobs that are very physical, involving moving things around or cutting things down, etc., typically we have machines to do the heavy lifting. So the world has really been transformed, the world of work. And by the way, all of these jobs, of course, pay much more than $10 per day. In fact, minimum wage is typically more than $10 per hour. So how did we get here? How was this transformation achieved, and by what steps did it happen? That is our question for today. This should be personally relevant to every one of us because, of course, pretty much everyone has to work for a living or did at one point. But it is also more broadly relevant. The story of work is part of the history of progress, and understanding how work evolved illuminates the legacy of reason, science, technology, industry, and capitalism. I now see the history of work as evolving in roughly two phases. In the first phase, which roughly corresponds to the 19th century, we greatly improved the productivity of work, which was the central problem. This meant better pay for everyone and more opportunity, especially for women and unskilled labor. However, during this time, working conditions got worse for many people. And of course, there was sort of general upheaval in the economy and in society. The world was transitioning from one mode of production, the traditional craft production and cottage industry that had dominated for centuries or millennia, and was transitioning to a very different new mode of production, industrial production. In the second phase, which roughly corresponds to the 20th century and until now, we have incrementally improved those working conditions, solving the problems that were created in the first phase, while we continue to expand industry and to improve pay. Although, side note that you can ask me about in the question period if you're curious, it's possible that pay has not improved quite so much in the last 50 years or so. Okay, so let's first talk about that first phase, the dramatic increase in labor productivity. In a world of low labor productivity, about half of the workforce had to be farmers just to keep the world from starving. Agricultural productivity was so low that a single farm family could feed themselves and approximately one other family. So something like half the workforce was on the farm. Many of the rest of the people were engaged in making basic necessities. A lot of people were involved, for instance, in spinning and weaving to just make cloth for clothing and other uses. In such a world, low pay was inevitable. You cannot consume what you have not produced, or more to the point, no one can consume what no one has produced. Someone must produce it first, and therefore, the average person cannot consume more than the average person produces, at least not for very long. So low pay was a necessary consequence of low overall labor productivity. And in hard times, this meant long hours for people just to scrape out a subsistence living. In such a world, safety would forever remain a luxury. When you have such low labor productivity, dangerous jobs such as mining, for instance, there's just going to be no surplus resources, time, attention, money to devote to safety engineering. The world was, in fact, considered inherently dangerous, and we'll return to this later. And again, there were simply not that many jobs to choose from. How could this problem be solved? Well, as always, Aristotle knew what was up. He put his finger on it about 2,500 years ago. In the Politics, he wrote that if every tool could perform its own work when ordered, if thus shuttles wove and quills played harps of themselves, master craftsmen would have no need of assistants, and masters no need of slaves. Indeed, this was one of the key ways in which we improved labor productivity. There are really a number of parts to the story. This is really the story of the entire Industrial Revolution, but I'm going to summarize it with three key themes that I think are most relevant. One is mechanization. We invented machines to do the work for us. Two is the institution of the factory, and particularly the way it was organized. And three is the application of energy to all of these purposes. Let's just briefly review these so we have the detailed context of how the Industrial Revolution created labor productivity. First, mechanization. For pretty much every job that was done by hand before the Industrial Revolution, we invented new machines to automate the work. For instance, spinning and weaving. Here we see on the left how spinning was done by hand with a drop spindle, or perhaps you would have a spinning wheel, which was somewhat more productive. During the Industrial Revolution, the late 1700s in particular, machines were invented to automate the spinning process. You see on the right here a machine known as the water frame. You can see that this model has 8 spindles and could spin 8 threads at once, whereas a spinner could only spin 1 thread at once. But very soon there were models with over 100 spindles. So imagine such a machine being tended to by just 1 or 2 workers. A dramatic increase in labor productivity. Similar things happened in agriculture. Whereas we used to reap wheat by hand with the sickle or scythe, the scythe is what you see there on the left, laboriously stepping through the field 1 or 2 feet at a time. In the 1800s, we invented machines to do this work. That picture in the upper right is the McCormick reaper invented in the mid-1800s primarily by Cyrus McCormick. Could be pulled through the field by horses with people just sort of raking the wheat off, and eventually they didn't even need to do that. And then eventually, through a long process of iteration and improvement, this led to the modern combine harvester, a large, powerful machine with a swath 30 feet wide that rolls through the field at 10 miles an hour, faster than any human with a scythe can do it, cutting down the wheat and threshing it and pouring out a torrent of grain. In terms of labor productivity, just rough orders of magnitude, the reapers of the mid to late 1800s did the work of about 10 men with scythes, and a modern combine harvester does the work of about 100 men in the same time. That is labor productivity. Even when the machines were not fully automated, they allowed people to do better and faster work. This is an example of a machine tool, a very important class of inventions in the late 1800s, whereby machinists could create parts that were higher quality with much less work. They could do it much faster. The machines added the quality and the precision of the parts without having to file them down in a very detailed fashion. The second theme, again, is the organization of the factory. Within a factory, rather than the traditional craft system, you had a finely tuned division of labor. So if a product, such as, for instance, a clock or a gun, traditionally would have been made by a master craftsman who learned how to make every part of the machine and how to assemble them all together, and who would do it all himself or perhaps would delegate tasks to assistants or apprentices in his shop. In the factory, the dozens, perhaps, of steps needed to create one of these products would be farmed out to different people, each of whom would specialize in a single task, and no one of whom had to be a master craftsman. This allowed for a lower skill level to be highly productive in the factory, and also allowed people to specialize. And you lose time when you're switching tasks. So sitting at one station and doing one task over and over allowed people to be more productive. This also, in the factory, the flow of materials and tasks was optimized throughout the shop, throughout the factory, to minimize the time wasted in moving parts and people from one place to another. Systems of measurement and accounting were instituted to find instances of waste, to see which products and processes were making or losing money, and ultimately to optimize the whole thing. Eventually, assembly was done using interchangeable parts. It was parts that were made to such a high degree of precision and quality that any one part could be swapped out for any other. Not only does this, of course, make repairs much easier and more feasible, but it also speeds up assembly. Without such interchangeable parts, the people who were doing assembly had to file each part to fit the rest. And with interchangeable parts, you skip that entire step. All of this culminated in the assembly line perfected in the early 20th century, especially by Henry Ford. In the assembly line, waste was minimized because workers no longer moved around to different stations to do different jobs. Instead, the machines moved to, or the products rather, moved to the workers. That bit about measurement and accounting, by the way, that middle bullet point, may seem kind of trivial, but it absolutely was not. Here is a quote from Andrew Carnegie from his autobiography about the importance of such systems. When he started investigating iron making in the mid to late 19th century, he said, "I was greatly surprised to find that the cost of each process was unknown. He heard of men who thought their business at the end of the year would show a loss and had found a profit, or vice versa." Just imagine that. Tallying up your books at the end of the year and thinking you'd profited and found, whoops, nope, we actually made a loss this year. Oh, well. He says, "I felt as if we were moles burrowing in the dark, and this to me was intolerable." And that was why he set up a system of weights and measures in his iron-making factory. The final theme is energy. New energy technologies such as engines and motors, first the steam engine and later gasoline and internal combustion engines and later electric motors. These were powering all of the automated machines that were doing the work in the factories. They powered the power tools that craftsmen and machinists would use. They powered cranes and lifts to move heavy equipment and materials around. Gas tractors on farms pulled plows through the fields and pulled those combine harvesters, which were very heavy machinery. And of course, energy technology engines created vast transportation networks which connected the world in a global web of commerce and allowed for much greater division of labor and specialization and increased everybody's productivity. Just to drive home the effect of these machines, listen to what one coal miner in South Wales had to say about an electric coal cutting machine that was installed in their mine in 1914. Quote, "What a collier could do by working hard all day, this machine would accomplish in 2 minutes. The holing had been such hard and monotonous work that I considered this machine a boon, for it did the very hard slogging for us." That really summarizes the effect on labor of the Industrial Revolution. Going along with all of these, trends and changes, the GDP per capita, after stagnating at a very low rate of growth for centuries, skyrocketed during the Industrial Revolution and started on a very fast rate of growth. In Western industrialized nations, the GDP per capita has grown 20 to 30 times since its pre-industrial levels. And it didn't happen right away, but eventually this was reflected in wages. It took some decades from the traditional start of the Industrial Revolution for wage growth to really happen, but it absolutely did. Economic historians debate about exactly when this began happening, but they all agree it happened sometime between roughly 1820 and 1850. And you can see that wages have grown by orders of magnitude as well. However, not everyone was happy about these new developments, at least not as they were happening, and frankly, still not today. There were some good reasons for this. Factory work was arduous and demanding, and workers worked very long hours. Workers lost autonomy. In the traditional system of cottage industry or craft production, they could set their own hours, direct their own work, socialize and take breaks as much as they wanted, etc. And they were not able to do that under factory discipline. They were working much harder. Craftsmen who had traditional skills, such as those master craftsmen who knew how to make every part of the machine, suddenly found their skills devalued in a world where the skill was built into the machines. The factories, frankly, were not nice places to work, many of them. They could have dim lighting, bad smells, they could be dirty, there could be loud noises from the humming and throbbing of the machines. And worse, the factories were actually dangerous places, and we will go into this in some detail in the second half. Going along with that, as people were migrating, there was a mass migration from the countryside to the city as people left the farms, as agricultural productivity improved, and people found new jobs in the expanding industries of the cities. However, in the late 1800s, this was associated with actually increased mortality levels. The cities were dirty and crowded and frankly a little disgusting in many ways. They did not yet have modern sanitation systems, and so they had much higher rates of disease. 19th century social reformers were very worried and upset about all of these real problems, especially about their effects on women and children who were going to work in these factories, as they had worked, of course, on the farms. One of the greatest critics of these developments, of course, was Karl Marx, who said that the worker becomes all the poorer, the more wealth he produces. I guess he didn't see that chart a few slides back. Huh? Oh well. The worker becomes an ever cheaper commodity the more commodities he creates. With the increasing value of the world of things proceeds in direct proportion the devaluation of the world of men. No, that was Marx's take, at least. So why did they do it? Why did people go to work in these factories? They chose to do it in many cases. Well, a big factor was pay. The increased productivity allowed for increased wages, and there was a wage premium to working in the new industrialized world. A couple of data points here from economic history. In Britain in the 1830s, one economic historian has found that there was a 50% wage premium for moving from the countryside to the city. Agricultural workers compared to unskilled laborers in the building trades in cities. The laborers in the building trades earned about 50% more. And another economic historian found that simply the discipline of the factory itself commanded something around a 66% wage premium. Weavers working in disciplined factories, those long hours, made more money than if they were working at their home or in a shop where no discipline was enforced. But it wasn't just about money. It was also, for some people, about freedom and independence, especially for unmarried women. In the 1800s, some of the most famous factories in the world were the textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts. And the women of Lowell who went to work there became famous as a class. One of them wrote a memoir later who said about unmarried women in particular, quote, "From a condition approaching pauperism, they were at once placed above want. They could earn money and spend it as they pleased. At last they had found a place in the universe. They were no longer obliged to finish out their fated lives mere burdens to male relatives." Continuing the quote, she says, "For the first time in this country, woman's labor had a money value, and thus a long upward step in our material civilization was taken. Woman had begun to earn and hold her own money, and through its aid had learned to think and to act for herself. Here are some reasons that women went to the Lowell mills, quoted from a magazine, a periodical put out by the mill girls themselves called the Lowell Offering. Of one it was said, she has a wealthy father, but he is very penurious. She has been ill-treated in so many families, she has a horror of domestic service. Wanted to get out of there and try a different job. Her lover has gone on a whaling voyage and she wishes to be married, he wishes to be married when he returns, and she would like more money than her father will give her. Noticing a bit of a theme here. Her parents are wicked infidels. Sometimes you just need to get out of the house. Or, more straightforwardly, she hates her mother-in-law. One song or poem in this periodical summed it up. One verse out of a song called The Song of the Spinners said, "Despite of toil, we all agree, out of the mills or in. Dependent on others we ne'er will be, so long as we are able to spin." That sums up the sentiment of many. So that was phase one, how we created labor productivity and what it meant for people in terms of independence and higher pay. Let's now look at how we achieved health, safety, and comfort at work. And in particular, I'd like to really focus on one case study, which is accidents and injuries within the new factories. Now, early factories were dangerous. The very sources of productivity that we just looked at, engines, machines, increased use of power and energy, these created new risks. There was, as I said, a transition from an old mode of craft production to a new mode of factory and industrialized production, and neither workers nor management had yet fully adjusted to the new world. They needed a mentality shift that they had not yet made. One historian finds that between 1869 and 1927, every additional horsepower per worker that was used in the factories, quote, raised injury rates as much as 3%. The risks of factories were many. Number one was exposed machinery. Drill bits, cutting blades, even simply belts and shafts and flywheels and so forth. All of these were very hard pieces of machinery that were moving at high speeds, some of them deliberately designed to cut or smash, and it was very easy for body parts to get cut in them. Here in this picture, a worker is demonstrating an accident that happened. Unguarded walkways high up, especially imagine a blast furnace in a foundry, and there's a walkway high up without even a railing. Cranes moving overhead carrying heavy materials that could easily be dropped. Boilers that reached high pressure and could explode. Workers lost fingers, lost eyes, arms, and sometimes even their lives. The root of the problem was fundamentally a wrong attitude towards safety on the part of both workers and management. Both of them saw safety as the responsibility of the individual worker, not the responsibility of management to provide a safe working environment. This was left over from the craft tradition in which this made sense. A master craftsman was a skilled and responsible individual who knew what he was doing and really didn't want anybody telling him how to do his work. He was responsible for safety within his own shop. And really, in this era, workers' own carelessness or lack thereof mostly affected themselves. So it was up to individual responsibility. This was not so in the new factories, where it was very easy for one worker's mistake to injure someone else. For instance, if one worker was cleaning or adjusting a machine while another worker turned the machine on, somebody could easily get hurt. Everyone attributed injuries at this time very commonly to quote-unquote carelessness, which, even if there was an element of truth to this, was really a dead end in terms of any sort of root cause analysis of what went wrong and how to fix it. Jobs were simply considered inherently risky, which made sense because at the time, frankly, life was inherently risky. Whether it was a physical danger from machines or physical danger from horses, or danger from the germs that were flying around and killing everybody at all ages before we learned how to fix sanitation. Life was risky. People died of all sorts of causes at all sorts of ages, and so people just accepted this as a fact of nature. They had not yet learned to attribute human agency to risk and disasters, to realize that we can prevent them. All of this attitude was reflected in the liability laws of the time. It was possible for employers to sue, for workers to sue their employer if they were injured on the job, but it was very easy for employers to avoid liability. If they could show any amount of negligence on the part of the worker, they could avoid liability. If one worker was injured by a different worker's negligence, the employer again could avoid liability. And they could avoid liability if they simply it could show that the risks were kind of inherent to the job and were a normal part of the job. They would say, well, the worker knew the risks and they accepted them. A fundamental attitude shift was effected around the end of the 19th century and in the US, the early 20th century. And key to this was changing the liability laws. First in Germany, then in Britain, and finally in the US, a no-fault workers' compensation system was instituted, in which we said, we're not going to try to show whose fault it was. There's a simple system that says that the employer is always liable, but rather than settle this through a tort lawsuit, we're simply going to have a schedule of payments that the employer must pay. So, if you injure a finger, then here is the amount that you get for it, and the employer is liable. One thing this did was it made injuries a lot more expensive for employers, and so they sat up and took notice. And it made financial sense for them to invest in safety. It also led to a mentality shift. Rather than the emphasis or the priority being on avoiding liability, the priority shifted to preventing accidents. Companies formed safety boards. And some of the first of these, incidentally, were done at the largest companies. You can ask me in the question period why it was that the largest companies led the way when it came to safety. U.S. Steel, the largest company at the time, and DuPont Chemical were two of the first ones to institute, even before the liability laws changed, actually, they were starting to institute safety boards. And these safety boards were staffed by engineers who saw it as a professional responsibility to create safety through intelligent engineering. The employers began to see accident prevention as a legal and moral responsibility. They collected statistics, analyzed the root causes of accidents, determined best practices, and shared information. Here are some of the specific things that they did. First and foremost, putting guards on the machines, guards and enclosures to keep people from sticking their hands and fingers into those belts and shafts and pulleys and blades and so forth. Automatic shutoff mechanisms for machines if anything got caught in them. Railings on walkways. Pretty straightforward. Mechanized handling of materials through cranes and lifts and so forth. Safer than doing it by hand. More clearance around dangerous areas such as machines and furnaces and railways. Stronger furnaces to prevent, for instance, hot metal breakouts in iron making. Safer chemicals, such as finding substitutes for ammonia. Lots of safety equipment, safety glasses, gloves, leggings, steel-toed shoes, hard hats. Incidentally, workers typically did not want to wear these things at first. And you can ask me in the question period, again, how the workers actually showed really little concern for their own safety. And again, safety had to be led top-down by the companies themselves. They established on-site medical facilities to treat the injuries right away. And there were very strong education and training programs, first simply to raise awareness of the importance of safety and to keep people from circumventing the guards and the other safety mechanisms and so forth. And later, when specific best practices were figured out, training for workers in how to do their jobs and perform their tasks in safe ways. All of this led to huge decreases in injury rates. Here is some historical information that was collected about how the injury rates decreased in various industries and at the DuPont Chemical Company in particular over the early decades of the 20th century. You can see that the injuries were reduced by 90 to 95% in many cases. Electrification in particular was a boon not only to factory safety, but to all factory working conditions. Electric lighting was much better than the old forms of lighting, and this made things safer because you could see what you were doing, made it more pleasant to work in a factory that was well lit, and it obviated the old forms of lighting through burning things, frankly, candles, oil, gaslight. All of these were not only dimmer, but also led to smells and, of course, stultification, less oxygen, and, of course, fire hazard. Electrification obviated a lot of the mechanical systems that were previously in place. So previously, a large central engine would be set up, and it would be connected to a central power shaft that ran through the ceiling. Belts would come down from the shaft to run all of the machinery, and the machines would have to be hooked up to these belts. And all of this was moving parts that people could get their body parts stuck in. So by getting rid of belts, shafts, pulleys, and flywheels, just increased safety through those mechanisms. Also, because the machines didn't have to be put along a central shaft, the factories could be reorganized. The machines could be placed not in a single central line, but they could be reorganized according to the flow of materials. This increased labor productivity, going back to theme number 1, but it also made things safer because less handling and less moving of parts all around the factory just was less chance for accidents. And of course, electric motors were cleaner and quieter than anything where you have to burn fuel. So, physical work and dangerous work was becoming less physical and less dangerous. But at the same time, a smaller percentage of the workforce had to be involved in those physical dangerous jobs. More and more of the workforce was shifting towards indoor, comfortable jobs, office jobs, for instance, clerks and management. Retail jobs in the new retail establishments that were cropping up, such as the department store, which was invented in the late 1800s. In this picture, of course, you see telephone operators, and there were more opportunities for people to go into intellectually challenging and fulfilling jobs, such as science and art. Previously the domain of patronage, these became jobs on a capitalist market that you could go sign up for. Here are some statistics that reflect the composition of this changing workforce in the United States. In 1870, almost half of the population still were working on the farm. By the modern age, that has reduced to around 1%. And you can see that service jobs and management and professional jobs, previously a small percentage of the workforce, now make up the vast majority. Management and professional jobs are the ones that we can roughly say are the most intellectually challenging and fulfilling, not routine in the least. The last theme we'll look at is that we're all working less than we used to, at least at the height of the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s. As the world got wealthier, child labor could be reduced. When you don't need to send your children to work just to make ends meet for the family, turns out people stopped doing that. Children used to work on the farms. Then when factories were introduced, they worked in the factories. And then over time, child labor was reduced. So here is how this was reduced in Great Britain from the mid-1800s to the early 20th century. Similar chart for the United States. This one covers a slightly later time period, but you can see the great reduction in child labor. And when children don't have to work, they go to school. And the number of years of schooling greatly increased from the late 1800s to today. High school graduation rates greatly increased in the United States. These went from, I think, under 20% to up to around 80% today. And more education, by the way, meant that more people were able to get those more desirable, office and retail and management jobs. When you did go to work, people worked less. So that factory discipline that caused people to work 60, 70, or 80 hours a week, 12 to 14-hour days, 6 days a week, gradually was reduced. As people got richer, there was a labor movement to introduce first the 10-hour day, down from 12 to 14, and later, of course, the 8-hour day. The weekend was also expanded from 1 to 1.5 to 2 days. So now we work only 40-hour weeks. Unless we want to work more, of course, but most people only have to work 40 hours. We also get more days off for vacations and holidays. So yet another way in which we're getting wealthier, we consume some of our wealth as leisure time, essentially, rather than as increased wages. And at the end of our lives, we can also work less by retiring. Retirement is essentially a modern phenomenon. It used to be that people more or less worked until they dropped. They worked until the end of their lives or until they were simply too infirm to work anymore, and they had to be supported by their family. This is the labor force participation rate of 65-year-old men. You can see in the mid-1800s, it was at 75%. Most of them, if they were lucky enough to live that long, were still working. Now it's around 20-25%. And remember, as more people were retiring at earlier ages, they were also living longer. The life expectancy was increasing, especially through improvements in sanitation, vaccines, and antibiotics. And from a life expectancy at birth of around 40 years in the mid-1800s, that has now climbed to 80 years. So, if you did actually, more people were living to retirement age, and then more people were living past the age of retirement in order to be able to enjoy it. Summing up, one economic historian has calculated or has estimated that over a lifetime, in 1881, a 20-year-old man could expect to spend about half of his waking hours working for money. By 1951, that had decreased to a third, and today it's around 20%. Fully 80% of your waking hours over the course of your life can be spent either not working or at least working not on the market, working not for money. This is because we go to school longer. We're not working as children anymore. We have reduced work hours during the week, more holidays and vacations, and then we get to retire. So, many people worry about the machines taking our jobs. Well, it turns out the machines have already taken a lot of our jobs away from us. They took away manual jobs, dangerous, dirty manual jobs that no one wanted to do in mines, in factories, on farms. They took away jobs from children. They took away jobs from the elderly. They took away all of our jobs on nights, weekends, holidays, and vacations. And all of that is a very good thing. By the early 20th century, this trend seemed so clear that John Maynard Keynes predicted that eventually no one would really have to work at all, and we would only work in order to occupy ourselves because we wanted to. He thought that a 15-hour week would be plenty enough for this purpose, and so he famously predicted, not super seriously, but he famously predicted that maybe we'd have a 15-hour week. Economists have been asking for decades how it was that he got this wrong. Well, simply he might not have been super serious in this prediction. B, it might have been that he just got the people's preferences wrong. Really, once you get down to about 40 hours a week, it's fairly comfortable, and there's not a strong need to reduce it. People would rather work more, earn more money, and have a better standard of living. Another potential explanation is that we've actually saved up the leisure hours to the end of our lives. We consume them in retirement. But another possibility is that Keynes simply didn't understand the spiritual nature and meaning and purpose of work. As Ayn Rand pointed out, productive work and a career is a central purpose that serves to integrate all the concerns of a man's life. Without a central purpose, she said, a man is lost in chaos. With this perspective, is it really such a good thing that we're working less? Well, I think it basically is a good thing that we are, or that at least we're able to work less if we want to. Of course, anybody can work as much as they want. The way I see this, kind of summing up, is that there are both good and bad aspects of work. And the history of work, the history of progress within the world of work, is that we have been gradually reducing the bad aspects of work and enhancing and making more room for the good aspects. We have less toil and drudgery and physical demanding work. We have less routine and monotony. We have less risk and danger. And at the same time, we have more productivity, and that means more pay as well. We have more creativity and problem solving, overall more of the spiritual aspects of work. So reducing the physical aspects has really enhanced the spiritual aspects of work. The less work it consists of manual labor, the more there is room for the mind. So, what can we expect from the future of work? Well, allow me to indulge in a bit of speculation here as I extrapolate these trends. I think we will continue to see more automation. Automation of trickier tasks, perhaps through robots. Automation through forms of artificial intelligence of routine mental tasks, just as we have automated the routine physical tasks. And this will mean more productivity and higher real wages for everybody. We will continue to get richer. We will continue to see, I think, more leisure. We'll see, I think, early retirement, more people taking on more years of education, perhaps more people taking a gap year after college to go travel the world or explore different things before choosing a career. Probably more vacation, more parental leave for people who are having kids like me. We're already starting to see this expand from just a few weeks to months at some companies. And, I like to look at Silicon Valley, where I happen to live, and where I used to work, for, what are some of the trends of the future? One thing I've seen among wealthy Silicon Valley engineers, especially young people who are already earning a lot of money, is that when they decide to quit a job, they'll do it without having another job lined up. In fact, sometimes they won't even look for their next job right away. They'll take a few months off after quitting a job to just relax, maybe catch up on personal projects, get an exercise routine in place, diet a little bit or whatever, and then they'll start looking for work a couple of months later. They have that luxury because of savings and because of a really excellent job market. They're not at all concerned about, the risk of not finding work. So if the job market for everybody was as good as the job market for Silicon Valley engineers, everybody could do that. I think we will also see the pendulum swing back a little bit towards flexibility in work. There is something of a trade-off between flexibility and stability or reliability. Before, when there was more kind of craft production, cottage industry, and more people working for themselves, there was a lot more flexibility in how and where and when you did your work, but the work was less reliable. You only got paid for output rather than for simply showing up and doing the job. Well, now with remote work and gig work, we are starting to see the pendulum swing the other way. There are new forms of work now where people can choose more where and when to work, sometimes with the trade-off of less reliability. So with gig work, for instance, this is, for instance, driving for Uber or Lyft, or perhaps shopping for Instacart, types of work like this where the worker shows up whenever they want to and goes off the job whenever they want to and simply grabs tasks off of a queue as they're assigned to them. And again, this allows a lot of flexibility for people, but comes with somewhat less reliability. You don't know exactly how much work you're going to get today or how well it's going to pay. Again, this is a trade-off, and we're allowing people to choose a new point on this trade-off. Overall, I think we will continue to see work get more meaningful, more interesting, more enjoyable, creative, and fulfilling. Eventually, we will all be poets and philosophers. Thank you. Thank you all very much, and if you like this kind of material, please check out my writings at rootsofprogress.org, or if you're on Twitter, find me on Twitter as Jason Crawford. And I guess we'll go to questions.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I was just wondering why the employees didn't care about the safety guidelines that were set by the companies.
Yeah. So first, I'll just talk a little bit of evidence that this was the case, and I can speculate a bit on why. So one interesting thing pointed out by a safety historian, Mark Aldrich, is that when there were strikes, the workers struck for a lot of different reasons, including pay and hours, but they very rarely struck for safety reasons. In fact, there was at least one documented strike against I forget what it was, a new safety practice or machine or piece of equipment. So the workers seemed unconcerned with their own safety. And then when safety practices were introduced, they were introduced top-down by management and by new safety departments. And the workers often resisted. They didn't like being told how to do their jobs. They didn't necessarily like the new procedures. If the procedures slowed them down, they didn't like being slowed down. Sometimes they found a guard on a machine to be inconvenient and they would take it off. Oops. They didn't like safety goggles and hats and boots and stuff. It was uncomfortable and unattractive. And so sometimes they just didn't want to wear it. Why was this? A couple things. I think it was just a holdover of tradition. They were used to a dangerous environment. Like I said, the world used to be very dangerous. And so they just kind of accepted that. Men in particular saw danger as manly, and if you were worried about your safety and wanted to wear a hard hat or something, you were seen as kind of a sissy. And again, the workers were chafing at the loss of autonomy, and they just didn't like being told how to do their jobs. Also, I think there's just it's hard for people in general to think about bad things that might happen with low probability. It's hard for people to do statistical thinking where they say, wearing these safety goggles will be a little bit uncomfortable every single day, but it will reduce a very small chance of losing my eyesight. Making those kind of trade-offs is just, people don't naturally think in statistical terms like that.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Next questioner, come on down.
Go. Online question, Jason. Can you recommend books or documentaries objectively documenting the transformative period of the Industrial Revolution? I find that many of the typical illustrations are overly dark and biased.
Let's see. There is not, in my opinion, a single book that really captures what happened in the Industrial Revolution, at least not to my satisfaction. In fact, that's why I'm writing one. I'm writing a book called The Story of Industrial Civilization that will cover this. There are a number of books that I have enjoyed that tell pieces of the story. I would go first to rootsofprogress.org and look at the bibliography. There are a number of books that I recommend. If you want a kind of overview that is not very well integrated, but will give you a bunch of little vignettes of various things, there's one called A Brief History of How the Industrial Revolution Changed the World by Thomas Crump. That is decent and has a number of interesting stories. And there's a bunch of other ones. Energy, A Human History by Richard Rhodes is another one. It's sort of focused on energy technology, but tells a lot of the story. Richard Rhodes is very good. Look at the bibliography for other examples.
Hello, Jason.
Hello.
You mentioned that as people moved off the farms, they were moving into factories that were unpleasant, dangerous, away from farm work. But how do the dangers actually compare, and the work actually, the hours and the dangers compare to farm work?
It's a good question, and I tried to look into this in researching this talk, and I've not yet been able to find really good hard data. So nobody was really tracking nobody was writing down how many hours did people work on a farm. Nobody was keeping track of accident rates. There's really no good data on injuries or accidents until like the 1880s. So we have to just sort of guess. Farm life was definitely not easy. It was extremely physical work. It was backbreaking manual labor. There are debates about how much did farm workers actually work. So some historians say that the work went from sunup to sundown. Others document, a good amount of leisure. So I don't have a final answer. I do think that people who worked in the crafts and in more urban settings actually did have a good amount of leisure. This surprised me. I did not assume this, but the more I've looked into it, the more it seems that people took many days off. It was traditional actually so they did not get Saturday off, but then they got Sunday off for religious reasons. They get paid on Saturday. They'd go out, drinking on Sunday night, and then they'd all be hungover on Monday. And sometimes they just wouldn't come into work on Monday. And then maybe they'd work a little bit on Tuesday. And then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, they'd work long hours to make up for it. So in fact, the taking off on Monday was called, they had a joke that it was a religious holiday. They called it, I'm observing Saint Mondays. So from what I've seen, I think they actually worked closer to sort of normal hours. Now, of course, the pay that they were able to get, what they were able to produce for this was quite small. And there's a fascinating paper by, I think, economist Gregory Clark called Factory Discipline that argues that essentially individual workers typically did not have the discipline to make themselves work enough to earn all the money that they really wanted. If you forced them to do so by putting them under very strict factory discipline, they were willing to take such jobs for a wage premium. But if you just left them to their own devices, they would goof off and not earn as much money as apparently they would choose otherwise. So I would like to have a better answer to this whole question. The injuries, I think, really did increase in the new factories. I think the new factories were a new form of production that people were not used to. They used big, heavy machinery that was moving very fast and had a lot of power behind it. And I think it simply was more dangerous than working on the farm. But I don't have hard statistics to confirm that.
Another online question. UBI, Universal Basic Income, it's a horrible idea, of course. Your talk seems like the information that UBI proponents need to hear and digest to understand the need and value of work. What do you say to the UBI advocates?
I mean, UBI is just another form of welfare. I don't think there's nothing super innovative or creative about it. It's just, if you're in favor of welfare, you're going to be in favor of UBI, and if you're not, you're not. So I think really it goes to, I don't think you're going to get anywhere in the UBI debate, incidentally, by talking about the spiritual value and the psychological value of work. People have tried that, but I think it just doesn't, the proponents of UBI are not swayed by that. So I think that debate is really just a much more fundamental debate about altruism and about the welfare state. It's as simple as that.
Hi, Jason. Thomas Schubotham. You're in California, right?
Indeed.
Okay, so you're talking toward the end of the talk about freelance work and so forth. You're familiar with the California AB 5 law?
Yes.
And then there's also the plans, at least from I think the Democratic Party, to make that a national policy. Can you comment on how that would affect work? I mean, obviously it's not been very good in California.
Yeah, so a brief recap of this for people who don't know the context. In the United States, there are two basic classes of employment. You can be an employee or a contractor. Employees are legally entitled to a number of benefits, and I think you have to offer them health insurance and you have to pay higher taxes and all sorts of things like this. Contractors, you don't. So companies are always trying to classify employers as contractors when they can, but you can't legally always do that. There are certain restrictions around this. This new class of gig work that has cropped up is really, honestly, neither of those two categories. It's neither traditional contracting nor is it traditional employment. And if you're going to regulate it at all, the only rational thing to do is to create a third category. But this has not been done, and so there was this law in California that essentially said that these things had to be classified as employees, not contractors, the way they were being done. And this just increases costs in a way that neither the employers nor, frankly, most of the employees actually want. And so it's just another burden on people who just want to do jobs and those who want to employ them.
It's eviscerated.
I don't know in detail what.
It's eviscerated
Yeah.
the music business.
It's terrible.
Yeah.
And so freelance writers, lots of people are now suddenly having to be classified as employees when they never wanted that. So, I don't know in detail what the impacts have been. I can't recount that, but I know it's been a destructive law. And so I don't know what the prospects are for having it nationwide, but.
It's something that Democrats, I'm not trying to be partisan one way. I know that the Democrats have made it a big part of their program and would pass it if they could. Biden and then all the other people have said that they want it.
Sure. That's a classic. Yeah.
Another online question. This one's a little more philosophical. Could you comment on the idea of a work-life balance and how one can better talk about this goal without dichotomizing work and life? Is there a single concept that can subsume the spiritual values denoted by the term life as used here?
It's a good question. I don't like the term work-life balance because it does imply that there's something, that your life is something separate from and even in tension with your work. At the same time, I don't know a better term. You could call it the work-personal balance. That's a somewhat more awkward phrase. It also implies that work is not personal, but, at the end of the day, everybody kind of knows what you mean when you say personal life. It's your your life outside of work, and that life is very real and important. And everybody does have to find the right way to figure out. Everybody has to decide for themselves how much they want to work and when they want to do it, and whether they're going to do any of it at home or all of it in the office. And what will happen when other demands are competing with work. It's a real choice that everybody has to make. Jeff Bezos has said that rather than work-life balance, you should strive for work-life harmony. Maybe he used the term work-life integration, and that when things are going well at work, you'll feel better at home, and vice versa. So I think ultimately it is an integration. But there is a real question that is indicated by work-life balance, even if it's not a great term. So just kind of recognize that, and then make the decision for yourself of how your work fits into your life, and how much of your time and energy you devote to it versus other values. And I would say, rather than moralize about sort of slave driving yourself to work harder and harder, the real key is to find work that, if possible, to the extent possible, find work that you are obsessed with and that you don't want to leave. That's what I did, and I eventually turned my all this work for me started out as a hobby, and I got so obsessed with it that I turned it into my full-time occupation. And now I don't need hobbies, because I took the thing I was doing as a hobby and I made it my work. So if you can do that, I recommend it.
Thank you, Jason. So you mentioned that the catalyst for improvements in safety was legislation, and I've heard the same said about a lot of the benefits that you mentioned, or that were enabled by the improvements in productivity, such as the weekend, reduced working hours, schooling, so on and so forth. At least in my fantastic public school education, the credit for that has always been given to unions and to the government and so forth. In your research, have you gotten any impression of the extent to which those benefits were driven by legislation, or where the legislation was perhaps just sort of a codification of something that was already happening?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't really have the answer yet. All of this unfolded in the context of a mixed economy. And so to some extent, it was done through mechanisms that are compatible with laissez-faire. And I think the workers' comp liability system is such a mechanism. And to some extent, it was done simply through outright, kind of fiat legislation. I didn't cover that because the liability issues seem to be more important, at least for factory safety in the United States. However, there was safety legislation. I saw an intriguing note in the book that I read on this that said that in Europe, there was more of an emphasis on legislating specific safety measures and less on the liability. And what this meant was European companies focused more on compliance with the specific, the letter of the law, rather than on applying engineering, intelligence, and creativity to preventing accidents. That is a really intriguing note that I haven't had time to track down, but I think there might be an interesting lesson in that. And yes, it's true that, if you look at how is it that we got the 10-hour day and then the 8-hour day, well, eventually these things were mandated and legislated. What I don't have a great answer for, and by the way, I think it is important to note that, some of even the safety improvements ultimately I think should be attributed in part to social reformers and campaigners who were drawing attention to this and were giving companies negative publicity for the accidents. I think that did drive, some of the change. Stepping back a bit, there are two ways you can sort of interpret this, right? So the classic anti-capitalist interpretation of this whole story is greedy, evil capitalists who cared about profit and not people created dangerous factories in order to squeeze the maximum productivity out of people, and they worked them like dogs. And it was only when the heroic social reformers came along in the progressive era that we were able to rein this in and bring power back to the people. That's kind of the classic progressive or socialist narrative. A different narrative would be, look, all of these things were natural consequences of the way the world was at the time. The accidents were unavoidable because people had to learn about the new system and about how these machines could be dangerous. The long hours were a natural consequence of the low labor productivity of the time, and it was increases in productivity that allowed us to reduce hours and reduce child labor and, so on and so forth.
Time.
And perhaps it could not have, maybe it could not have happened in any other way than the two-phase process that I outlined. And B, maybe phase 2 was actually inevitable once we got to a certain level of wealth. Maybe safety and the end of child labor and so forth are simply luxuries that people choose to purchase once they hit a certain level of wealth. I think that the second story is mostly true, but I suspect that there's a little bit of truth in the first story, which is the role of active social reformers who called attention to problems and called for them to be solved. Even if those social reformers were sometimes working from a bad philosophy, I think they sometimes pointed to real problems, and those problems did need attention, and they did get attention focused on the solutions. I'm not sure that it would have just naturally happened and all got solved in good time without people calling attention to the problems. So that's what I think happened there.
Unfortunately,
I don't know how it all would have unfolded under a totally laissez-faire world. That's an interesting, speculative, exercise that somebody could do and maybe should do at some point, but I don't have an answer for that.
Unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions, but let's thank Jason one more time. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you very much, and feel free to email me. You can find my email on my website or find me on Twitter, and I'll try to answer any further questions you have. So long, everybody.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to never miss a video.